Hi, my name is Steve Yoder, and this is the first episode of Abbreviated Bios. For our first episode, we will look at a Southern American politician from before the Civil War who essentially had an open common law marriage with one of his slaves. His name is Richard Minter Johnson. Richard Minter Johnson was born on October 17, 1780 in Bear Grass, Virginia, to Robert and Jemima Johnson. His father was one of the largest landowners in Kentucky and served in the Virginia House of Burgesses. As a young man, Richard attended Transylvania College in Kentucky, then studied law under George Nicholas and James Brown. He was admitted to the bar in 1802. Most people seemed to like him personally, which would help his rise in politics. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1806, representing Kentucky. Johnson was one of the war hawks who urged war against Great Britain, and when the war began, he raised 2 regiments of volunteers and served under the command of William Henry Harrison. The volunteers he raised were called the Kentucky Mounted Rifles. It is in this war where the most important event of Johnson's life occurred. He led a cavalry charge against the Shawnee Indians at the Battle of the Thames in Canada, in which Tecumseh, the great war leader, was killed. Witnesses claimed Johnson had killed Tecumseh. This made Johnson a national hero. It would lead to his future political triumphs. Johnson returned to Congress a wounded hero. He began to work on ending debtor imprisonment in the United States. In 1819, Johnson began the first of 2 terms in the Senate. He introduced an unsuccessful bill to end federal debtor imprisonment. He also supported the end of Sunday delivery of mail. In 1828, Johnson lost his re-election bid because of his home life. This is where Johnson's life becomes much more interesting. Johnson had inherited land and slaves after his father's death. One of those slaves was Julia Ann Chin. She began living with Johnson as his common-law wife, since whites were not allowed to legally marry a slave. When Johnson was away, he put her in charge of the plantation, even of his white overseer. She also acted as a nurse for the Choctaw School. They had 2 daughters, Adeline and Imogen, who Johnson treated as his daughters, unlike most slave owners who usually treated their children by slaves as just more slaves. They would both eventually marry white men. He brought him up as his own daughters. When criticized on his domestic arrangements, Johnson said, "Unlike Jefferson, Clay, Poindexter, and others, I married my wife under the eyes of God," and apparently he found no objections. Johnson's district, unlike the state, found no objections to him and re-elected him to the House of Representatives after he left the Senate. It was during this time that Johnson and others finally outlawed federal debt imprisonment in 1832. This influenced the states to outlaw the practice for themselves. Johnson was a Jacksonian Democrat and began to aspire to the presidency or the vice presidency. In 1836, President Andrew Jackson named Martin Van Buren as his heir apparent. Richard Johnson decided to run for vice president. Jackson endorsed him even though his common-law marriage came up again, even though Julia had died 3 years earlier. Apparently, Johnson's main qualification for the election as vice president was that he had killed Tecumseh. His campaign slogan was, "Rumsey Dumpsey, Rumsey Dumpsey, Colonel Johnson killed Tecumseh." During the campaign, Johnson was criticized for his living arrangements. Political cartoons were made. In fact, you can see one above, which criticizes Johnson and portrays his mixed-race daughters holding up a picture of their mother and kind of trying to put out the idea that Johnson should not be elected vice president. During the election, Johnson had the most electoral votes but lacked a majority. The election then went to the U.S. Senate, where Johnson was elected 33-16. He's still the only vice president ever elected by the U.S. Senate. During his vice presidency, Johnson cast his tie-breaking vote 14 times in the U.S. Senate. In 1840, Johnson ran again with Van Buren, but they were both defeated. His political career was essentially over. He died of a stroke on November 19, 1850 in Frankfort, Kentucky. At a time when it was illegal for whites and blacks to marry, the U.S. had a vice president who had a slave as his common law wife. Thank you for listening to the first episode of Abbreviated Bios, and I hope you come back for the next time I post one.